So it's part 2 of lesson 12. We're working with APIs today. We've used a really simple one so far. We've embedded the Weather Network's weather widget into our footer in our Barry Eats site. So we're going to make our own API right now. So in our Barry Eats, I'm actually going to make a subfolder here. I'm going to make a new PHP file. Actually, I'm going to make a new directory, which I will call API. So the files for the website are in a separate folder from any of the files for our API. So in here, I'm going to make a new PHP file that I'm also going to call restaurants. So this is separate from the restaurant page we've created in our root folder. That one is the web page. This one is our API. It's our service only. We call it restaurants.php. I'm going to take out all my HTML because remember, all right, when we're building an API, there is no front end typically. It's just a service. I'm going to delete that and just put on some PHP tags. We'll maybe have a look at another common API just to get used to the format. Actually, I'm going to talk about this for a minute first now that I think about it. There are two common formats we use with APIs. One is older and one is newer. Does anybody know what's the most common format if we're going to exchange data with another application, like in here? What do we commonly use today? Because these might be written in different languages, right? One might be a PHP application, one might be Java, and one might be something else. What would be considered the standard today if two applications are going to pass data back and forth? What format is that data usually in? Close, not quite Java, because not every application can understand Java. What's a format that almost any application could understand, no matter what language the application code itself was created in? Good guess. No. Well, we need the keys, but I'm talking about the format of the data. If two programs are going to talk to each other, like here, what format, what's the most common format today to send data back and forth? It does start with a J, but it's not Java. Harsh? Right. What does JSON stand for? Again, this would be a good multiple choice question on the test that you're not having. You know what JSON actually means? Can you do a quick, use your Google foo and tell us? What is JSON? Right, so JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, so this is the most popular format in which APIs exchange data. So a Java app can talk to a C# app because both will understand JSON. Our PHP applications understand JSON. So JSON is nothing more than JavaScript arrays with keys and values. Okay? So here's how if we had an API, for example, it said to a site that had an API where we could order a pizza, right? Would have a crust key with a value, a toppings array where we could specify multiple values, and a status. So virtually every programming language can read and write JSON, just JavaScript. This is the current format that's kind of standard, and most APIs today will take requests in JSON and send responses back in JSON. The old standard, so here might be a single. So this is what one pizza order might look like in JSON. And it's pretty easy to read. Like we can follow this and it makes sense of what's happening here. The old format for this was XML. So similar data in XML would look like this. And there are some APIs that actually still let you choose. So for example, we go here. For example, Canada Post, mail service in Canada, they have an API. So if we, for example, want to look up shipping rates in a store, right? My customer wants to ship from here to here. The parcel weighs this much. How much do I charge the customer for shipping? So they have two versions of the API. We can actually, so this version uses XML, and this version uses JSON. The newer version, oh, actually, they both use XML, which is odd. So typically, older APIs will use this format. So this is kind of the older version. This is the newer version. Can you think of why more APIs now? Why did we move from JSON to XML? Because most programs can speak either one. What's the benefit of this version as opposed to this one? Why do you think JSON's more popular now? It's simpler. Yes. Why is it simpler, Abunk? Could be. Which of these is actually more characters, the JSON version or the XML version? Right. Why is the XML one bigger? Right, because every tag is repeated. That's right, Akshay, right? So instead of just topping appearing once, it appears twice. So not a big deal with a little request like this, but imagine we're asking for millions of records, right? If every record, every single value has both an opening and a closing tag, this uses much more bandwidth and is much slower. So it's more expensive and it's not as fast, right? So the JSON version is lighter, it's easier to read, and it takes up less space, less bandwidth. So more APIs now use JSON than XML. So we want to create a simple API that will return either a list of restaurants or a single restaurant in JSON format. And PHP has functions to read and write JSON. So we can take our object and we can create it as JSON, or we could read JSON. So let's try that. So first we'll lay out the comments. So the first thing we're going to do is the database. The only thing we're actually going to see in this page when we load it is JSON. What that data looks like will be up to the client application that actually calls it. That application will take the data and format it and display it however it wants to. Okay, so our database connection, well, that's going to be easy. Now the path is different. Remember, we're inside the API folder. Our database is up one level. So our path is actually .. ./db. We're inside the API folder here. And the database file is not in the API folder, it's in the root. So we have to go up out of API because we're down here. Disconnect is going to be easy, right? For starters, let's just select all the restaurants. Simple query will modify this after. So a user could select all, or they could select one. So I'll execute the query. And we'll execute it. We'll call fetch all. Anybody's internet connection come back yet, or is it still down? Still down. Okay. Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay. We'll try this. I don't think it will work this way, but we'll just try it this way for the moment. If I start typing JSON, notice there's a JSON encode. We can try and encode the entire data set. Probably won't work this way. We'll try it. And then we'll try to just print out in JSON format our list of restaurants. We may have to modify this code a little bit. We'll try it this way. So there's no HTML. This will just print a block of JSON. Let's see what happens if I go to API. So we actually do get JSON, kind of, but there's one kind of problem with it. What's the problem if you look carefully? It's correct, but not perfect. The ID is repeated. In fact, everything's repeated, right? Last class, 1 Georgian Drive, 1 Georgian Drive. So when we just encode the result this way, it's not quite what we want. It is valid, but it's twice as big as it should be because every single value has been repeated. So we'll have to manipulate this a bit. Now we can also check it. If we want to validate, there's this, we go to this site, if I search JSON lint, we can actually put in JSON and it will tell us if it's valid or not. So it's reformatted this way. It's easier to read, but notice everything's repeated. First, it gives us the index and the value, then it gives us the column name and the same thing. We don't want this version. We want the column names that are meaningful because the numbers are not meaningful in the values. So we've got to modify our code. We're on the right track. This produces JSON, so we could send this to some other application. So instead of just encoding this way, I create this as an empty array and then loop through. So we're going to add each one to our array. And then we'll encode it. We'll try it this way instead. Because when we automatically convert it, we get that duplicate. We'll try it again. Oh, we need to do one more thing. Bear with me for just a second. Still having the same problem. I think we may want to change the fetch all. Right. Okay. I think in our fetch all, we set it up I think this way, maybe we'll just try it. Be able to undo this process. Okay, yes, that gets rid of our repeats. And then we may just be able to put it back the way we had it without the loop. Just gonna try it this way. Bear with me. Yeah, that's more efficient. Okay, we don't need our loop. When we run our fetch, it automatically creates it as an array in our fetch. So then we can just encode it. We don't even really need this JSON results, I don't think. This would be a more efficient way. I think this should give us the same result. Yeah, it still looks like this. If we want to validate the JSON. So now we have no repeats. So there's our simple API for all the restaurants. Now we can set this API up as well so that if the user gives us either an ID or maybe a restaurant name, we only return that restaurant. Let's have a look at how this might look. Maybe I'll just add a comment here. Execute the query and return the results as an array. So that's what this is doing. Asking for it in an array format. So let's go and have a look at a common API, another one. For example, Spotify has an API we can use, right? We want to access Spotify library. So most APIs uses JSON. And generally, when we're going to use another company's API, there's a documentation that tells us how to use it. Here are the things you can do. So if we, let's see if we go here. So here are the different things we can do. So for example, with albums, so they have 3 versions of their get API. Notice there's no create, there's no update, there's no delete. You can't use their API to do those things, but you can use it to read the data. So if we call get with no parameters, that gets a list. If we call get, same address, but we put an ID on the end, that will get that one single album. Or get, and then the list, and then tracks would get all the songs on that album. So we want our API to work. So we've kind of built this version. This gives us the list. We want to modify it. So if there is an ID included, rather than getting the whole list, we're only getting that one album. So we'll do it this way. We'll initialize a restaurant ID variable as null. We get a restaurant ID passed in. We now need a where clause and a parameter with our SQL query, because instead of all the restaurants, we want only the one. So we're going to use our plus equals. We're concatenating onto our SQL. We need to make sure we put in a space here after restaurants where. We're adding this where clause on if we have an ID. Kind of like what we did with the search last week. And then we prepare our command, but before we execute it, we can check our restaurant ID has been set. We'll bind that parameter. So now our API could fetch either a list or a single restaurant, depending on whether there is a restaurant ID passed into the request. So let's try it again. So when we pass no ID, we get the list. Pass in a valid ID. Maybe I don't want to check if it's set. Maybe I'll say that it's not empty. Try that. That's interesting. So with no ID, get all. Let's see. So it's saying no parameters were bound. We've prepared the command. So this line is not working. I'll just check if our restaurant ID does not equal null. Because we're initializing it to null. If we have it value, see if that works. Interesting. Not the right ID, 10,006. Yeah. Okay, we'll have to see what's happening here. Print my SQL. Use it for debugging. So we'll print our query and print the ID to the screen. We'll see what's happening here. So it knows we have a value, but our value is empty. Because we never filled the restaurant ID variable. I could go back to using that now. If our get, we probably could use is set on both. If we have a parameter, add the where clause and populate the variable. And then bind. Well, that's better. Put in an invalid ID. It just doesn't give us anything back. I don't need those. So there's our really simple API. So we could actually call this from another program. I've tried it in the browser. I have this other tool I could use to try it. I'll just grab this URL. So this is a free program that allows us to make HTTP requests. So I'm using it to grade all of my semester 3's APIs. I put in their API addresses and then I make get post requests. If I do a get request, restaurant, there's our JSON that comes back. I click on, or if I put in an ID, any program could now use this API and get our list of restaurants. Maybe it's a website like, or a mobile app like, let's say TripAdvisor. Right? They want to see our list. They know we have a comprehensive list of all the restaurants in Barrie. So rather than them trying to collect all the data, they could just use our data. Good question. Okay, well, maybe they could also do it if we wanted. We could also allow them to search by ID or by name, for example, right? So we could add the same check. So in this case, they could actually search by either one. And our API could accept either an ID or a name. So as the creator of the API, it's up to us to decide what we're going to allow other people to do. We have full control. And typically when we create an API, we also have to provide some kind of documentation to other developers so they know how to call our API. What's the address? What methods are there? And what parameters do they need to pass us? And what will they expect to get back? Okay. So it's a request response model. So the documentation should lay out what is the URL, what needs to come in the request, and then what format. So here's an example of a request, and this is sort of a format of the response that comes back. So typically when we're going to work with someone else's API, we have to read the documentation to learn how does it work? What methods can we call? What things do we send those methods and what will come back? And if we're creating an API, we have to build this kind of documentation. Okay, so here's one example. I think I have another example I could show you. So this was an API. So I built a web application a long time ago. And then my customer, they wanted the website already built to integrate with another API. So someone who was logged into my site could automatically use this other service without having to have a separate login. They would log in through the site we built. So the developer created this documentation. He said, okay, here's what all the functions are like. So if you want a list of all the patients, here's what you send us. Other examples here. So this describes all of the requests and responses and all of the different things his API could do. So he had to create this because I didn't know how to work with his API until I got these instructions that would tell me how to do it. What's the status of our internet? Good? Okay. All right. So let's try, you know what, let's try ReCAPTCHA. I don't know we'll have time to do Facebook, but let's try ReCAPTCHA. So if you do a quick search online, just search for the word ReCAPTCHA. You'll get a link. They've just come out with a new version last month. We don't need version 3. It's a bit of overkill. They actually recommend people continue to use version 2. There's an article here. What's the difference between version 3 and 2? So version 3 is for power users that need lots of data about who's using their site. We just want basic spam filtering. Okay. So for example, a registration page might still use version 2. So that's what we want, is version 2. So when we go here, if you click on My ReCAPTCHA, you do have to sign into a Google account. So I'm actually going to use, I've got it up here. I'm going to go to My ReCAPTCHA. I'm already signed in as Google. So you get to this page, manage your keys. So I think Kartik, you mentioned about the keys. earlier, right? So in order to use many APIs, many services want us to create a set of keys so they know who is using their API. Doesn't cost anything typically, but they want to know what application is calling their API. So let's register a new site. So I'll just call this Gary Eats. We want ReCAPTCHA version 2. And we just want the checkbox that says I'm not a robot. And now it wants the domains. Okay? So you have to specify which domains this runs on. So the first one I've got is localhost 800. Also, run it on AWS, we need computer studies. So you'll want to add both of those to your domains. Yours would just be localhost. My localhost runs on 800. In fact, it may not even like this. I'll take out the send alerts. I don't care about being alerted, but I have to accept the terms of service. Okay? So just give it a label, ReCAPTCHA 2 checkbox. I'll try to register. Okay, it doesn't like that. I think it always works on localhost, so I may not even need this. Okay. So it's accepted. So part 1, so here's my site key. So this is public. This will go in my form. And if users view the source of our register form, they'll be able to see that key. This is the secret key. This goes on the next page, the save page. So before we save a user, we'll need to call Google's API and pass it our secret key so it knows what our website is. And then it will tell us whether the CAPTCHA code was validated correctly or not. Okay. So the first step says step 1, client side. Paste this link to the ReCAPTCHA API JavaScript. It says put it in your header. I don't think it needs to go in our header. I think we can just put that in our footer. So I'm going to copy that line. Footer. Here's our link to Google's JavaScript. Generally, it's better. It's recommended in the footer because it can slow the loading of your page down. When it's in the header, all the scripts have to load before the content below. By putting the JavaScripts in the footer, it allows the HTML content to load in the browser first. So generally, it's recommended they actually go at the bottom. Some scripts will have to be loaded at the top because they just won't work. So if you have to move it, move it. Otherwise, we're better off to keep it in the footer. And I think in my header, I actually have the jQuery file twice. I could actually take the jQuery file out and probably move Bootstrap down to the footer as well. Okay, so there we've linked. Second thing, paste this. That includes our site key. Paste it where you want the ReCAPTCHA to show up. So we're going to put this on our register form below the confirm password, but above the button. We have to move it. So I'm just going to copy that line, go to register. And above our button, I'll just put it in here for now. So this will use that Google JavaScript to generate a ReCAPTCHA code using my site key. I didn't even have to copy the key, just like with the weather network, it's embedded into the code Google gives us. So let's go look at our register page. Well, that's interesting. Okay, it didn't load. It did say put it in the header. So I have a feeling it will need to go in the header. If I look in my console, I probably have a JavaScript error. Just clear it and refresh. Oh, now I'm Bootstrap's JavaScript requires jQuery. And I have a syntax error. Okay, hang on. Move this. Okay, maybe I'll undo that change just for now. I'll put Bootstrap back where it was in the header. See if that fixes anything. Oh, my register page doesn't have my footer. Silly. Just need to add the footer to the register page. Here at the bottom. Forgot to include my footer. Okay. So there we go. We got our CAPTCHA showing up. Just like the weather network, all we did was copy and paste 2 lines of code. Link to the JavaScript. Now, this generates the code, but we're going to need some more code on the other side to actually validate it. Because right now, if I don't fill this out, if I just leave the CAPTCHA alone, I can still sign up. It still lets me, doesn't care. The CAPTCHA shows up, but we're not doing anything with it. So now we need to add some code here on our save page that actually calls the Google API, passes in the user's response, and Google will tell us if the CAPTCHA is okay. And if Google says the CAPTCHA is not okay, we don't want to let the user sign up. Okay. We need to check the ReCAPTCHA. So the first thing we need to do, copy and paste the secret key. So I'm going to grab my secret key. So we're going to make a call to API site verify. We're going to pass it the secret key. We're going to pass it the user's response. We can pass the user's IP address, but that's optional, so we'll ignore it. Copy this. And then we're going to pass Google the user's response, which Google says is in a field in the form called GReCAPTCHA response. So that's a hidden field that Google writes depending on, it captures whether what the user did. So that'll be in our post. Probably best to copy and paste it so I don't mistype the name, because that name has to be exact. So these are the 2 values we're going to send to Google. So now what we want to do is we want to send a request to Google, but we don't want to take the user to Google. We want to do this hidden, right? The user sees our page in the browser, but we want to send a request to Google, pass it those two values, and see what we get back. So what will Google send us back? Well, so we're going to send these two things to Google, and it should tell us what kind of response we're going to get back. So here's ReCAPTCHA version 2 with the checkbox. Right, so we've done this part. We can render the widget. Now this uses JavaScript. There's no PHP version, so we're going to just write a quick PHP version. Server-side validation, verifying the user's response. So we want to check the gReCAPTCHA response by doing a post, and this is the JSON we'll get back. The first value is success, true or false. There'll be a timestamp, we don't really care. And if success is false, we'll get error codes. So this is what we're going to get back. We're going to check for the success value. That'll tell us whether the CAPTCHA was successful or not. I'm going to make a hidden request to Google using the PHP curl library, which will allow us to send that request. We're going to initialize request. Set some options here. I'm going to send a request. First, we have to say, what's the URL? Where are we sending a request to? I'm going to go to Google and copy and paste the URL. This is where we're sending our ReCAPTCHA. We want to set another option called return transfer. Don't keep the user at Google, send the response back to our page. We just set that to true. We also need to say that we're making a post request, not a GET request. So we're setting up a post request to Google ReCAPTCHA API site verify. Curl is a library that allows us to make HTTP requests to any URL from within our code. It's even a command line tool. We could make a request at the command line and it would work. These are options we're including in that request. Where are we sending it? Is the request staying there or coming back? Coming back. And what's the method, get or post? So we're making a post request to this URL, and we want the response to come back to this page. We're going to create an array to store Google's response. So it will send us back JSON, and we'll need to parse that into an array. We're going to hold our secret. Oh, whoops, I've already used response. So I guess this should be. We'll call this API response. Oh, sorry. Now that we've created the request, we need to pass it the secret and the user's CAPTCHA response. This is create an array. Request values to Google. So we're including the key and the user's response in the request to Google. We don't want to send them an empty post. We need to send them the key and whether the user completed the CAPTCHA. So all of this is the setup. We haven't actually executed anything yet. The API call and check the response. This is where we actually execute our request. So that sends the request and then populates this Google response object. That will be a JSON object with a success value, and if there was an error, there'll be an error message. If our Google response this should send us back 1 or 0, true or false. If it's not true, we'll print an error message. We'll set OK to false. That's if we don't get a true response back from Google's API. If we do get a true response, we don't have to do anything. OK is still true, and then we can save the user. So all of this is all setting it up. We don't actually call Google until line 49. We're setting up the URL, the type of method, and passing it the data. And Google will send us back a true or false. So we can try this. Go to register. If I leave it unchecked, okay, but we did get the right result, although we do have a warning here. Think about that. What happens if I check it? Okay, so close, but not quite. So I did fill it out. Our Google response. So let's go back to their documentation. Let's see. Google gives us a success with value of true or false. So let's just print it out. See what we get, what that value is. Okay. We'll just print the whole thing first. Just a matter of parsing the response. Okay. So here we get success false. Time under duplicate because I submitted the same thing again. But if I go back, leave it empty. So if I didn't check it, this is the code we get back, right? Missing input. So there's success. Oh, it's JSON. I think we just have to decode it. Okay. Because our response is JSON, I can't read it. Equals JSON code. So we're converting it into an array, from a JSON object into an array. Right. So now if I go back, now if I fill it out properly, so now it saves, and then I'm good now. So using almost any of Google's APIs requires you to do this. Google login, you've got to go to the portal, the Google console. You want to use a Google chart, for example. They've got a chart API so you can take data and create charts. They'll always want you to create a set of keys, and then it's simply a request. You make a JSON request, and Google sends back data in JSON format. Okay, I'm going to give you lab 4. I will put all our code on GitHub, so here's what I want you to do for lab 4. It's due on Monday. It's very short. So for lab 4, whoops, just have to update that text, 1 second. We are going to add back them in here. Bear with me. So here's what I want you to do. At bottom of the restaurant details page, I want you to add the ability for somebody to make a comment. We already have reviews, right? It shows the reviews, but I want you to add the ability for somebody to make a comment through Facebook. The Facebook Comments API you're going to add at the bottom of the restaurant page. So when someone's looking at a restaurant, they can see any comments made. Those can appear underneath the current reviews. So if you search for Comments API, we'll take you right here to their social plugins, Facebook for developers. That's you guys. In order to use the API, you do have to log into Facebook, but pretty similar. Enter the URL of the website. Use the code configurator. So here's the width, how many comments it should show. Okay. You click the Get Code button. It will give you a JavaScript link to their API and a block of code you copy and paste into your form. That's it. And then it will add this comment box. So the way I'm going to test your lab is actually, is you just give me a link to your homepage. I'll click the restaurants link, and then I'll click, well, let me think about this for a minute. Okay, so I have to log into your site. Now, I told everybody to use the same login. I can't remember the password. What password do you use for your Barry Eats site? Okay, so I will log in, click on a restaurant, and I should be able to make a comment using my Facebook account, and it should get added to your restaurant detail page. Okay. So just note, in the Facebook documentation for the domain, they've put in example.com. You have to replace example.com with your own Barry Eats website URL. Okay. So it's as simple as that. Look up the API. It's really almost as easier than doing ReCAPTCHA, much closer to the Weather Network API. So you can probably do this in like 5 minutes, but you have until Monday at 5 o'clock. These are really easy marks. Okay? You just have to go here, generate the code, copy it, and paste it into your site.
Instead of the berries can be used in our assignment 1 or 2.
Yes. Yes, put it in anything you have working. So if you want to put it in lab 2 or lab 3 or assignment 1, actually, I don't want you to use assignment 2 though, because I haven't marked that. So then you're in there changing the code and I haven't marked that. So yeah, you can do it in lab 3 was a continuation of lab 2, right? Because lab 2 was just a list and lab 2 was edit and delete and lab 1. So do it in lab 1 or lab 2. Put it on any page in there. It can be on the main page or on the details page. I don't care. Okay, so Barry Eats or lab 1, lab 2, any of those. It should be so that I can add a Facebook comment. Okay. Well, it will generate this at the bottom of your page. So they're stored by Facebook, but they actually get displayed on your page. And there's an option built in here when you go to create a comment, there's an option that will say post on my wall. So if you want it to, it will actually post that comment on your Facebook wall so everybody else can see it. That's why Facebook makes the API available. So when you use it, it's driving traffic through Facebook to wherever you want it to. Okay, so this is very short. This doesn't take long at all. So everybody should do this. Everybody should get full marks on this lab. That's my expectation. Okay, I will push today's code to GitHub. And you guys have until Monday to do your 5-minute lab.